Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Civil Wars of Julia Ward Howe, a biography, by Elaine Showalter, narrated by Hilary Huber. Introduction. In November 1861, while she was staying at Willard's Hotel in embattled Washington, D.C., Julia Ward Howe wrote the lyrics to the most famous patriotic anthem of the Civil War. "It would be impossible for me to say," she wrote in her Reminiscences, 1899, "how many times I have been called upon to rehearse the circumstances under which I wrote the battle hymn of the Republic." Indeed, until she died in 1910 at the age of 91, Howe endlessly told and retold the story of how she had come to write the lines that made her famous. Everywhere she traveled or spoke, at a school in St. Paul, a Unitarian church in Chicago, a gathering of black women in New Orleans, or a flower-bedecked Memorial Day celebration in San Francisco, she was expected to read the words of the song or sing them in her trained contralto. And choruses and soloists around the world enthusiastically honored her by performing it as well. This oft-told tale, she noted, had become for many Americans the story of her life. A century ago, the first biography of Howe, written by three of her daughters and published in March 1916, just 6 years after her death, won the Pulitzer Prize. Awarded for the first time in 1917, in the midst of another war, the Pulitzer Prize had a strong moral and nationalistic purpose. Nicholas Butler, the president of Columbia University and the administrator of the awards, called Julia Ward Howe the best American biography teaching patriotic and unselfish services to the people, illustrated by an eminent example. Despite this sanctimonious encomium, the 2-volume biography was not as didactic as Butler's tribute makes it sound. The daughters drew on the Howe family correspondence, plus Julia's essays, poems, memoir, and journals, to tell a lively story of a woman as charming and funny as she was learned and thoughtful, as devoted to her large family as to public service. Howe was certainly eminent, unselfish, and patriotic. She had 6 children, learned 6 languages, published 6 books. She was a prominent figure in the churches and intellectual societies of Boston. She joined ardently with her husband in the abolitionist struggle. She traveled all over the United States, the Caribbean, and Cuba, and abroad to England, France, Italy, Switzerland, Germany, Holland, Belgium, Greece, Cyprus, Palestine, and Egypt. She founded and led the Association of American Women, served as president for the New England Women's Club, the New England Suffrage Association, and the American Woman Suffrage Association. Howe was the first woman to be inducted into the American Academy of Arts and Letters. Born 3 days after Queen Victoria, she was sometimes called the Queen of America. The daughters also wrote an inspiring story of their parents' marriage. When she married Dr. Samuel Gridley Howe, Julia Ward was an aspiring poet, a beautiful, accomplished, studious heiress, known in New York social circles as the Diva. Samuel G. Howe, 18 years her senior, was a hero of the Greek Revolution of the 1820s and a world-famous doctor who had developed a method for educating blind children. His name, the critic John J. Chapman noted, was known to everyone in the civilized world. Together, the Howes were one of the leading power couples of 19th century America, uniting exceptional intelligence, moral fervor, worldly ambition, immense energy, and public commitment. Living in Boston, they knew many of the key literary, political, intellectual, and scientific figures in the Civil War era, including Charles Sumner, Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, Margaret Fuller, and John Brown. They traveled to Europe on steamers as often as modern jet-setters would amass frequent flyer miles, and made friends there as well. Florence Nightingale was the godmother of one of their daughters, Dickens their guide in London. They were devoted and imaginative parents, and their marriage, in the title of another memoir by their daughter Laura E. Richards, was the fusion of two noble lives. But that first biography hid as much as it revealed. In reality, the marriage was turbulent and unstable, a prolonged domestic battle over sex, money, independence, politics, and power. The Howes disagreed, quarreled, separated, often lived and worked apart. Despite his inexhaustible compassion for the suffering, helpless, and deprived, and regardless of his dedication to the abolition of slavery, Howe held obstinate and conservative views on women's roles in public life. He expected his wife to be completely fulfilled in her domestic and maternal role, and to accept with gratitude his right to make all the decisions about their lives together. A towering figure in the field of philanthropy and social reform, at home he was dictatorial, restless, and touchy about his own authority. An ordinary man, as Chapman wrote, a man of headaches and irritability, a man of doubts and errors. Julia Ward expected to have a partner who would introduce her to his more consequential world of ideas and social reform, and allow her to act in it. She assumed that she would be an equal partner in their decisions and free to develop and pursue her own literary aspirations. She hoped to write the novel or play of the age. Her husband, however, tried to stop her writing after she published an anonymous book of confessional poems that enraged and humiliated him. He took control of her large fortune and lost most of it. Throughout most of their marriage, famous and beloved though Julia became, his expectations dominated hers. She had to exercise her power obliquely with the soft feminine weapons of tears, self-sacrifice, unselfishness, domesticity, and maternity. For personal self-expression and public communication, she had to use the conventional medium of lyric poetry, and then even that was eventually denied to her. Nevertheless, in the course of their marriage, she learned how to resist his dictatorship, respect her own needs, and develop, defend, and act upon her convictions. In sum, how to think about the manifold ways that the politics of inequality entered the household. Writing the Battle Hymn was the turning point in her life, and its renown gave her the power and the incentive to emancipate herself. The Civil War challenged 19th century ideals of separate spheres for men and women, changed assumptions about gender, and propelled women out of domestic confinement into public lives and careers. In Howe's case, this transformation was also a rebellion against her marriage. She fought a second civil war at home, battling with her husband over her rights to independence, equality, and a public voice. After her husband's death in 1876, Julia was free to forge a new identity. For the second half of her life, she was a leader of the fight for women's suffrage. She traveled alone or with other suffragists all over the United States campaigning for women's rights. She became an advocate for the emancipation of the silenced and subjected. Although her children, and then her grandchildren, continued to complain about her extra domestic activities and attempt to thwart them, Julia insisted on doing what she believed necessary and right. The glorious final decades of her life were a result of the limitations of her marriage and a refutation of its confining bonds. There have been a few excellent biographies since 1916, but there is none that looks at Julia Ward Howe as a major American heroine and sees the marriage of the Howes as a paradigmatic clash of 19th century male and female ambitions. The Civil Wars of Julia Ward Howe tells the story of her battle in that other civil war of emancipation. Chapter 1. The Princess in the Castle. Julia Ward grew up living like a princess in a fairy tale. The daughter of a wealthy New York banker, the oldest of 3 devoted sisters, and the pet of 3 energetic brothers, she spent her childhood in a splendid Manhattan mansion where the finest tutors instructed her in music and languages, and her summers with her grandmother and cousins in Newport. She was cherished, indulged, and praised. But, she confessed in her memoir, she also felt like a young damsel of olden time, shut up within an enchanted castle. And I must say that my dear father, with all his noble generosity and overweening affection, sometimes appeared to me as my jailer. The combination was paradoxical and prophetic. As she grew up, Julia would often relive the experience of the princess in the castle, loved and admired, but also restricted and confined. An avid reader, she dreamed from an early age of becoming a great writer herself and tried to prepare herself intellectually for the role. A vision of some important literary work which I should accomplish was present with me in my early life and had much to do with habits of study acquired by me in youth and never wholly relinquished. Her family tolerated her literary dreams and supported her habits of study, but expected her to become a belle first and a housewife after. Her brothers were educated to be successful professionals. The sisters were trained to have all the feminine accomplishments. At the height of their youth and beauty, they were known as the 3 Graces. Julia, the most beautiful and accomplished of all, was called the Diva. Julia's father, Samuel Ward, had made his own way to riches. He went to work at 14 as a clerk in the investment banking firm Prime and King, which had handled loans for the construction of the Erie Canal. Even then, he knew that he wanted to become one of the first bankers in the United States. By the age of 22, he became a partner in the renamed Prime, Ward and King. Ward was a disciplined, purposeful, serious young man, but his marriage in 1812 to 16-year-old Julia Cutler was a passionate love match. First to please her, and then to make up for the hard work and long self-deprivation of his apprenticeship, he set up an expensive household. Despite his pious, low-church upbringing and his wife's even stricter Calvinist beliefs in hellfire, sin, and damnation, Ward had no guilt about his wealth. Spending money on the family was not sinful, he believed, but proper and spiritually sanctioned. Banking was a lofty and ennobling profession, valued for the power it confers of promoting liberal and beneficent enterprises. Within a decade of their marriage, the Wards had 6 children: Samuel, born in 1814, Henry in 1817, Julia on May 27, 1819, Frances Marion in 1821, Louisa in 1823, and Annie in 1824. Another daughter, also named Julia for her mother, had been born in 1816 and died of whooping cough at the age of 3. Somehow, in the intervals of repeated pregnancy, childbirth, and nursing, Julia Cutler Ward did fundraising for the Society for Promotion of Industry Among the Poor, which helped to train impoverished mothers as seamstresses. She also wrote poems and published them anonymously in the newspapers. Although she joked that her husband was indifferent to her effusions, he expressed some pride when her poem on General Lafayette's arrival in New York was published. In 1849, her poem, Si je te perde, je suis perdu, was included in Rufus Griswold's anthology, The Female Poets of America. By 1820, the Ward family was living in a big house at number 5 Bowling Green at the tip of Manhattan, fast becoming the chicest address in the city and known as Nobb's Row. Ward enjoyed buying splendid furniture, gold cornices, and the grand pianoforte, without which no society home was complete. He gave his wife extravagant gifts, most spectacularly a lemon-yellow carriage, which had bright blue cushions and a blue interior, and was pulled by a pair of bay horses with black manes. This luxurious vehicle, the Cadillac of coaches, cost $1,000 and was driven by a black coachman named Johnstone. The young Wards had an active social life. In the winter, they went sleighing and entertained their friends at caudle parties, where steaming hot whiskey punch was served, and the guests got red as roosters. Samuel threw himself into the efforts to find husbands for his wife's two unmarried sisters, Eliza and Louisa, hiring tutors and professors to train them in ladylike accomplishments and social graces, and buying them stylish gowns for their debuts. To inaugurate their Bowling Green home and introduce Louisa to eligible young men, the Wards invited 70 of the most fashionable people in New York, including Mrs. John Jacob Astor, wife of the richest man in the United States, to a lavish dinner dance. There, Louisa met a suitable lawyer from Savannah named Matthew Hall McAllister, and later married him. As Samuel Ward became richer and richer, he also worked harder and harder, and gave generously to New York universities and charities. Bowling Green was a good place to raise small children. In 1823, the fort in New York Harbor, protecting the city from invasion in the War of 1812, and had been converted into a resort named Castle Garden, a popular destination for fireworks, picnics, and ice cream, with a big auditorium for celebrations and concerts. It is now Castle Clinton National Monument, which gets 3 million visitors a year as the ticket office for the Statue of Liberty. Every day, Julia's Irish nurse took her for a walk to nearby Battery Park to watch other little girls playing, and every afternoon at 3, Johnstone came to take the Ward children and their nurses for a sedate ride. Julia Cutler Ward tried to teach her little daughter to sew. Reflecting on the failure of her early indoctrination in needlework, especially her struggles with the use of a thimble, Julia Ward Howe blamed her own clumsiness. But she did not have memories of her mother as seamstress. She remembered her parents instead as a glamorous couple whose entertainments she was sometimes allowed to watch as a special treat, especially a night when they took her out of bed and dressed her in an embroidered cambric slip with a pink rosebud on the waist. 4-year-old Julia was taken down to the drawing rooms, which had undergone a surprising transformation. The floors were bare, and from the ceiling of each room was suspended a circle of wax lights and artificial flowers. The orchestra included a double bass. I surveyed the company of the dancers, but soon curled myself up on a sofa, where one of the dowagers fed me with ice cream. This dreamlike party, with its illuminations, decorations, music, dancing, beautiful dresses, and sweet foods, was to remain her image of enchantment throughout her life. The days of wine and roses were short. Julia Cutler Ward endured several bouts of inflammation of the lungs, or tuberculosis, was bled by leeches and blistered with poultices, and became so slender and pale that she drew attention as a fashionable beauty. As her sister Eliza observed, since her illnesses began, Mrs. Ward had grown wondrous handsome. Her complexion was clear and glowing, her figure extremely slim and genteel, and the expression of her countenance peculiarly interesting. Genteel slenderness, however, gave way to sunken cheeks and persistent headaches and coughs. Faced with an early death, Mrs. Ward reverted to the Calvinist beliefs of her family, repented for her sins, and prayed for forgiveness. On November 11, 1824, giving birth to her 7th child, Annie, she died of puerperal fever at the age of 27. Her relatives had gathered around her sickbed to pray for her salvation. As her granddaughters would write, she was almost literally prayed to death. In the middle of the night, the family woke the children to tell them their mother was dead and took them to the bedroom to kiss her cold cheek. Julia remembered very little of these early years, but she dreamed of her mother until the end of her life, and each of her own pregnancies was accompanied by depression and fear of death. Samuel Ward was so devastated that he refused to see his infant daughter for weeks. In his grief, he became a convert to his wife's Calvinist beliefs and a model of evangelical piety and sobriety. He never remarried. Soon after her death, he sold the Bowling Green house and most of its furnishings and moved the family uptown to a house at number 16 Bond Street, then at the northern edge of Manhattan, just above Houston Street. In 1825, Bond Street was a remote, isolated, and risky neighborhood. But Samuel saw its potential, and he persuaded his family to buy property on the same street. His father at number 7, and 2 unmarried brothers, his brother John next door at number 8, and his brother Henry at number 14. By the 1830s, Bond Street had become a flourishing and exclusive neighborhood of more than 60 houses. The 6 motherless children were surrounded in the Ward compound by an enclave of affectionate aunts and uncles. Aunt Eliza, who had not yet succeeded in finding a husband, despite her brother-in-law's best efforts, moved in to take care of them. She was used to being the family caregiver. After her own father's death when she was 15, she had taken over the management of the household and raised 4 younger siblings. Tall and awkward, with large uneven teeth and hairy moles on her face, she had good-naturedly put up with being the designated spinster and enduring the humiliating customs that went with the role. At the weddings of her younger sisters, she had to dance in her stocking feet. When her youngest sister died, she was available to supervise the upbringing of her nieces and nephews. As Julia described her childhood, her father's religious views ruled the household, and the early years of my youth were passed in seclusion, not only of home life, but of a home life most carefully and jealously guarded from all that might be represented in the orthodox trinity of evil, the world, the flesh, and the devil. There would be no more parties or balls. Samuel Ward forbade dancing parties, the theater and concerts, and gave up his favorite pastimes of smoking and playing cards. To his worldly brother's dismay, he even became the president of the Temperance Society and threw away the bottles of fine Madeira in his cellar. To protect his children, especially his daughters, from the dissipations of fashionable society and even the risks of general intercourse with the unsanctimonious, Ward restricted socializing to the family circle. Their family routines were unvarying, austere, and strictly observed. Simple meals, water to drink, and prayers twice a day. He also took a puritanical view of Saturday evening, regarding it as the proper time to prepare for the marathon religious observances of Sunday, which started with the luxury of coffee and muffins, but then devolved into 2 church services plus 2 Sunday school meetings. Julia got some pleasure from looking at the showy bonnets, all flowers and feathers at the Grace Church, known as the Church of the Holy Milliner. In the intervals between sermons, the children were permitted to read pious books, and Julia was grateful for the didactic stories of Mrs. Sherwood, which passed Sabbath muster. Mr. Ward was a stern disciplinarian, whose displeasure cast a chill over the children, although he never spanked or whipped them. My little acts of rebellion were met with some severity, Julia recalled. She adored him, but feared him as well. For the Ward daughters especially, life was spent indoors, like the little girls of Victorian genre painting, who are often represented looking wistfully out the barred window. The older boys had a riding ring where they could ride their ponies, but the girls were discouraged from outdoor pursuits. When they were allowed to take walks, they were clothed in thin cambric dresses, white cotton stockings, and Moroccan kid slippers, even in the coldest weather, and often came down with colds. proving conclusively to the minds of the elders how much better off they were within doors. Much later, with daughters and sons of her own, Julia reflected on the fashions, activities, and health of boys and girls. Boys are much in the open air. Girls are much in the house. Boys wear a dress which follows and allows their natural movements. Girls wear clothes which almost impede their limbs. Boys have, moreover, the healthful hope held out to them of being able to pursue their own objects and to choose and follow the profession of their choice. Girls have the dispiriting prospect of a secondary and decorative existence, with only so much room allowed them as may not cramp the full sweep of the other sex. Still, Mr. Ward, whose own education had been cut short and who had never been to Europe, wanted his children to have the educational opportunities he had missed, to learn to speak foreign languages, and to be taught by the best and most expensive masters. The boys were sent to board at the progressive Round Hill School in Northampton, Massachusetts, directed by Joseph Cogswell and George Bancroft. Cogswell was a literary sophisticate who had spent years in Europe, where he became a friend of Goethe, got to know Sir Walter Scott, and even visited the celebrated lesbian couple, the ladies of Llangollen. Bancroft rose to become a distinguished historian and minister to Great Britain and Berlin. The girls were mostly educated at home, but Julia had a group of extraordinarily gifted and accomplished teachers. Indeed, her private education may have been better than the rote learning her brothers received at boarding school, and was certainly more intense and tailored to her talents and interests. While her brothers often complained of the dullness of their studies, she considered the hours with her books the brightest of her day. As a little girl, she studied French 6 to 8 hours a day for conversation, and read the fables of La Fontaine. A French dancing master came to teach the girls steps they were not permitted to practice outside their home. As Julia grew older, she studied piano and the works of Beethoven, Handel, and Mozart with a London-trained instructor. Professor Lorenzo L. da Ponte, the son of the man who had written the librettos for Mozart's Don Giovanni and Le Nozze di Figaro, taught her Italian, and Giovanni Cardini, who was affiliated with the Italian Opera Company in New York, worked with her on singing and voice training. She also studied mathematics, philosophy, and history. Her reading, however, depended on which books her father would allow and buy for her. She dreamed of writing a great novel or play, but she knew very little about either genre. Low-church evangelicals like Samuel Ward suspected fiction of dangerous frivolity, and Julia mentions only a few novels: Paul et Virginie, Dickens, Sir Walter Scott, and Anna Jameson's Diary of an Ennuyé. She always loved the theater, or rather the idea of the theater. At the age of 7, she had been taken to the opera to see La Cenerentola and the Barber of Seville. But then her father cracked down, seeing the drama as distinctly of the devil. After that, she knew of theatrical matters only by hearsay. As a little girl, she dramatized and performed a sensational story called The Iroquois Bride from a literary annual, which ended with Julia and her brother Marion, playing lovers, stabbing each other. Her shocked father quickly put an end to nursery theatricals. Later, she tried to write a dramatic adaptation of Scott's Kenilworth, and then undertook an even more ambitious and preposterous subject, a play suggested by Gibbon's account of the fall of Constantinople. These efforts do not survive. While her brothers were widening their horizons, Julia's life in the house of girls was increasingly conventional. Her 9th birthday marked the end of her childhood and the beginning of feminine propriety as the oldest daughter of the family. Her dolls were taken away, and she entered a neighborhood school, Miss Catherine Roberts' Day School for Young Ladies, where she learned to parrot the stiff religious language of Calvinist sermons. When her 10-year-old cousin Henry was sick, she wrote him a formal letter, notable for its total want of sympathy, affection, or concern. I hear with regret that you are sick, and it is necessary.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?